Brothers, I want to give you a brief summary of what we did yesterday, and we are still in the part of the desert, which is the introduction of the Gospel of Mark. The words which we noticed are beginning. Mark is the only one who does not say that it is the gospel of Jesus Christ, but who says it is the beginning of the gospel. And so our question is, to what does this word beginning, which is Greek arche, to what does beginning refer? Does it refer to the part where Mark brings in the quotation from Malachi and Isaiah and end there? So the beginning ends there with the mention of the messenger. Does the beginning end when Jesus comes into Galilee in verse 14 to proclaim the good news of God? Or does the beginning end in chapter 16, verse 6? Where the young man at the tomb gives the message to the women that Jesus is not here and he is risen. We got to contend with this question. We cannot answer it yet. We can only have the questions. So it is the beginning of the gospel. And the word gospel used here does not mean written works. It means oral proclamation. Because in the early church, for the first 30 years, stories about Jesus, parables about Jesus, miracles that he worked were told orally from the time Jesus died in around 30 or 33 till about 65, which is the date given for the Gospel of Mark. So around 30 years, there is the oral tradition, and therefore, when the evangelist, even Paul, uses the word gospel, they mean oral proclamation. This is the gospel about Jesus Christ. So Mark already tells us very clearly in the beginning that it is the good news about Jesus Christ. And we saw that this name, Jesus, is both a common name, and Matthew gives us the etymology of the name in Matthew 1:21, when we are told that Jesus means God saves. So we are contending with an individual whose name means God saves, and who Mark says is the anointed one. This anointed one, which for Mark is Christos or Messiah or Christ, is also for Mark Son of God. Now, in what sense does Mark use this term Son of God? Does he mean it in the sense of Son of God used for kings who were also regarded as Son of God? Or does he mean it in a special sense? We will understand that when we come to the text and we go through the gospel. In chapter 1, verses 2 to 3, the next verses, Mark speaks about a messenger. Now, this is a combination of two Old Testament texts, Malachi 3:1 and Isaiah 43, which are combined by Mark to make it applicable in a very special way to John the Baptizer, who is the messenger. If in the Old Testament and through the lips of Malachi, through the writing of Malachi, if the messenger was Elijah, here in Mark, the messenger will be John the Baptizer. What will this messenger do? He will come to prepare the way of the one who is coming. If the Isaiah messenger would prepare a highway for our God, this messenger will come to make straight the way of the one who is coming after the messenger. And that is why John the Baptizer, as far as Mark is concerned, is portrayed much in the way Elijah was portrayed. His preaching, his clothing and food are very much akin to Elijah, and The proclamation is largely about the one who is to come after him, and Mark, by stating details about himself in comparison with the one who is to come, shows very clearly that John the Baptizer is inferior, is at the service of the one who is to come. And then, even though this is the case, the one who comes after him, namely Jesus, very clearly in Mark, with no ambiguity whatever, is baptized by John. And even though Matthew chapter 3, verses 13 to 17, Luke chapter 3, verses 21 to 22 will narrate the baptism in a different way, not to give as much importance to John, they do narrate the event. They would rather, if they were given a choice, not write about this event, but they do because it was a foundational experience in the ministry of Jesus. It began, in a way, the ministry of Jesus, and it was historical. In the baptism, all three are agreed that there are three events which occur. And the first is that the heavens are torn open or rent open or torn apart. This verb which Mark uses is a very strong verb, and it is also coming possibly from Isaiah 64:1, where Isaiah is asking God to come down and to tear open the heavens and come down on earth one last time. So when Mark tells us that the heavens were torn apart, he is possibly also saying that this plea of Isaiah, the prayer of Isaiah, is answered now in the baptism of Jesus. The Spirit, which is very clearly God's Spirit here, descends like a dove. The fact that it descends means it comes from above, and so it is God's Spirit, because this voice from heaven is the voice of God, given the three-tier understanding of the universe which was held at that time. And this voice, through the quotation of two Old Testament texts, Psalm 2 verse 7 and Isaiah 42 verse 1, issues an invitation. For me, this word invitation is crucial, it's important. The voice issues an invitation. There is no force, there is no coercion, there is no pressure. Jesus is invited to be king, servant, servant, king, king who becomes king by being servant, and king who becomes king only by being servant. When I use the word only, I mean there is no other way. So very clearly, this is the invitation, and I say that Jesus accepts the invitation, but the acceptance of the invitation, and these words are my words, is shown by Mark as a passive acceptance in verses 12 to 13, and is shown as an active acceptance in verses 14 and 15. So Mark shows that Jesus accepts the invitation, and in these verses we see Jesus accepting the invitation passively. Passively is my word, and I will say why I use the word passively. Notice the two words which I have highlighted in yellow. The Spirit, again, the Spirit which came down now on Jesus like a dove. Mark possibly means this same Spirit. So it is the Holy Spirit. It is the Spirit of God, even though Mark does not mention the word holy, but we can assume that it is the Spirit of God. What did the Spirit do? It drove Jesus. A very, very strong word. Ekbalo is the Greek. It drove Jesus. And where did it drive Jesus? It drove Jesus into the wilderness. The Greek word eremos is translated in English sometimes as wilderness, other times as desert, and still other times as lonely place. The word eremos, depending on the context, is the English translation, but the word used is the same. So eremos basically stands for a place where Jesus is alone. That is the understanding of wilderness. So in other words, the Spirit drove Jesus, literally a harsh verb, drove him to be alone, because there is need for reflection. There is need that Jesus will have to ask himself whether he accepts the invitation or not. Now, the other evangelists, Matthew and Luke, follow Mark in this regard, namely that the temptations, even there, Matthew 4, 1 to 11, Luke 4, 1 to 13, are immediately after the baptism. So the understanding of all the three evangelists is this, that the temptations are connected with what happened with Jesus at his baptism. It is only in the Gospel of Matthew that you must interpret the temptations differently. The reason is because the voice in the Gospel of Matthew will not say, "You are my beloved son," or "Thou art my beloved son," like in Mark and Luke. In Matthew, the voice says, "This is my beloved son." The pronoun "this" is pointing Jesus to the people. In Mark and Luke, Jesus is being told or invited. In Matthew, it is a revelation, not to Jesus. Jesus already knows in Matthew that he is the beloved son. That's why in the baptism, the voice says, "This is my beloved son." In the transfiguration, in Mark and Luke, the voice will say, "This." Like in Matthew, also at the transfiguration, this. So in Matthew, the voice says this at the baptism and the transfiguration. In Mark and Luke, the voice says "you" at the baptism and "this" at the transfiguration. Why this there, we shall see later. But now, even Matthew and Luke understood the temptation, even though they had the three temptations in all likelihood available to them in Q, which is quelle, the written source, the source of discourses and sayings. They took it from there, but placed it in their gospel, like Mark, immediately after the baptism. And the placement of the temptation scene after the baptism is that they want that their gospels also read the temptation as Jesus not accepting the invitation. So the king-servant invitation. This verb, drove, is used by Mark to show when Jesus drives out demons, he expels demons, he sends them away. So the understanding here is of a strong moral compulsion. In other words, here, Jesus takes the offensive. Jesus does not become defensive. He takes the offensive. The Spirit drives him. I'm going to face the challenges of this temptation. I'm not going to run away. And I am going to face them. Not by being among crowds, not by engaging in work, not by distracting myself, by being busy. No, I am not going to distract myself. I am going to be alone. So wilderness here, which is desert, translated desert, wilderness, basically means that he was alone. That there is no activity to keep him busy. There is no work to keep him busy. There are no companions to converse with. It is simply being by himself, you might say, alone with the alone. And why? Because later we see that Satan tempts him and the angels minister to him. So the understanding of Jesus' 40 days, the closest parallel seems to be, while there are other parallels of 40 years of Israel in the desert and so on, the closest parallel seems to be David overcoming Goliath because of the overcoming aspect. So he was tested or tempted by Satan, and he is with the wild beast. Notice, at the time when Adam and Eve were driven away from paradise, they were told that the wild beasts or nature would be against them. They would try to cut up the head of the serpent, and the serpent would strike the heel. So it's an idea of nature contending with human beings, of humans abusing nature. Now, Jesus is with the wild beasts, and he can be with the wild beasts. So there is a sort of harmony in that sense. Jesus is shown or portrayed as the new Adam. Adam failed, Jesus passes. So Jesus was tempted. This verb tempted, peirazzo, to put to test. Let us see if you can. Let us see what you're made of. What is the metal? What is within you? If there is something strong within you, then you can overcome this. So it can be used in two senses, and both the senses are involved here. A good sense where God tests you. You are like gold which is tested in fire. Or Satan tempts Jesus by trying to draw him away from what God is asking. So God wants to see, does my son, whom I have called my beloved son, accept this invitation? And notice, the invitation is to be king, who becomes king by being servant. And it's a tremendous, tremendous, tremendous invitation to accept. And we see throughout the life of Jesus, there is this temptation. So this temptation, as a matter of fact, Luke 4:13 says it very beautifully when he says, and the devil left him at the end of the third temptation. The devil left him, Luke will say, until an opportune time. That means Luke is telling us, who are the readers of his gospel, don't assume that Jesus had 3 temptations. After that, he was without temptations. No, he kept having temptations. And Mark, Matthew, and Luke, who were really not so concerned as we are possibly today about the sinlessness of Jesus. He was without sin and made sin. That is not their challenge. Their challenge is to show that even in the temptation, Jesus is strong. Their challenge is to show that Jesus is completely, totally, in every single sense of the word, human. So in other words, we cannot give our humanity as an excuse. Sometimes we sing without realizing this hymn, I'm only human. What do you mean you're only human? You're not an animal. You're not a bird. You're not a plant. You're not a river. You're not a sea. You're not a tree. You're not a fruit. You are human. So after Jesus, anyone who says, I'm only human, is already setting a limitation on him or herself. And that is wrong. We do not set limitation. And this is the danger of what is known in Catholicism as the heresy of Docetism. The heresy of Docetism is to regard Jesus as a phantom Christ. Jesus could do it because he was God. I cannot do it because I'm human. That is a wrong way, a wrong theology. It's terrible theology. I must say that because Jesus did it, and because he gives me the strength to do it, I can do it. I'm human. So I glory in my humanity, I do not use my humanity as an excuse. I do not say, I'm only human. No, I'm human. And because I'm human, there are so many things which I can do, which animals and birds and plants cannot do. So let me see that and look at life, especially in these challenging times, in a positive way. Let me look at the positive within me. Let me look at the strengths within me as Jesus himself did. And so the temptation of Jesus, his being led by the Spirit into the wilderness, is also a challenge to us that we have to persevere. Notice the word 40 days is to indicate a long time. It's not just done 2 minutes and 3 minutes. No, that means it will keep coming. The challenge to be negative, the challenge to give up, the challenge to use my humanity as a crutch rather than an advantage, those challenges will keep coming. And I have to say to myself, I will accept these challenges. I will strive. I will struggle. I will be as positive as possible. And then, in contrast with the dangerous wild animals, we can see that God is there, but God doesn't want to interfere. God doesn't want to intervene. He respects our freedom too much. And he respects the freedom of Jesus. And so God is there, but Jesus has to be aware. God will not impose. God will not thrust. God will not intrude. And yet notice, the angels, diakonum, basically diakonia, is to serve. Or a deacon is somebody who serves. And they are there present. The possible reason why Mark does not mention fasting is because he doesn't have the 3 temptations. In the first temptation of Matthew, which is stones into bread, the first temptation of Luke, notice, is stone into bread. So if stones or a stone has to be turned into bread, then Jesus has to be hungry. So they have to show that he fasted. But Mark does not need to do that because it's taken for granted that when you're in the desert, you cannot eat luxurious food, and surely you're going to make what is available, drink what is available from the fruits and so on, and basically that. So Adam was not able to resist the temptation, and he succumbed to the tempter. Jesus, the new Adam, as a matter of fact, in this, Luke is followed, or rather Luke follows Mark, because if you look at the Gospel of Luke, unlike Matthew, Matthew's genealogy begins with Abraham, moves to David, the Babylonian captivity, and from the Babylonian captivity to Christ. That is Matthew's genealogy. Luke's genealogy begins with Jesus and ends with Adam. Luke wants to show that Jesus is coming through the first human being, and here Mark also has something similar when he speaks about the wild beasts and Jesus being with wild beasts, and they're not harming him, and angels coming and ministering to him to indicate that Jesus is the new Adam, much like Luke does, but in a very, very detailed manner. Luke shows that Jesus who comes now is the new Adam. Because Luke's genealogy has 11 generations of 7 each. 11, and Jesus begins the 12th generation, which will be a new generation. That's basically Luke's genealogy. And Mark says it, the same thing. Mark is saying Jesus is the new Adam, but in a very succinct and a very, very short way. Now, just a brief word about our structure. You might remember that the structure was a chiasmus, or a concentric structure. Notice, desert, tomb, Galilee, Jerusalem, and so on. Now, this part is what we are going to deal with now. We have just finished the 13 verses. And I said that in chapter 1, verses 12 and 13, we are given the narrative about the passive overcoming of temptation. I called it a passive overcoming, and when I speak about the active, I will tell you why I call this active and the earlier one passive. So we are finished up to verse 13, which ends by Jesus overcoming temptation. Yes, how do we know that? The angels came and ministered to him. I call it a passive. And now we are going to move to the Galilee section, which begins in chapter 1, verse 14. The Galilee section is made up of a total of almost 8 chapters, part of chapter 1 and part of chapter 8. So almost 8 chapters. Because this is a broad section, I want to divide it for you into 3 chapters. I'm calling the Galilee, it is the Galilee section. What you see now below you would be chapters. So this is the first chapter, which, notice, begins in chapter 1, verse 14, and ends in chapter 3, verse 6. This chapter, the first chapter, has 4 parts. The first part is what I term as a summary. Here, the summary is in the form of a proclamation. The second part concerns the disciples. In this chapter, it is the call. The third concerns the kingdom with authority. And the fourth, a conflict. So if you notice, the Galilee section has 3 chapters. I have shown you now the first chapter, which I term the chapter of authority. The reason why I call it the chapter of authority is because in these chapters and verses, Jesus is shown coming into his ministry with tremendous authority. So this chapter is divided into 4 parts: summary, disciples, kingdom, conflict. Notice, deliberately, to avoid making it too heavy, I have not given you the chapter and verses of each of these small parts, which I will do a little later. Now only understand my division. This is what I call the second chapter of the Galilee section. And in the second chapter, the kingdom will come, but it will come with struggle. If in the first chapter, the kingdom comes with authority, in the second chapter, the kingdom will come with struggle. Here also, like in the first, there is a summary. And like in the first, there is something which is connected with the disciples. And what is it here? Earlier on, it was the call. Here, it is the choice and the naming of the disciples. Then the broad part in this chapter, the broad part is the kingdom. And if I use the word struggle on top, here, just for a change of term, I'm using the word difficulty. You can even say the kingdom comes with struggle, the kingdom comes with difficulty. The kingdom will come, of course, even though with difficulty, and there is a conflict. If notice, in the first part, the conflict is with outsiders, represented by Pharisees and Herodians. In the second part, the conflict is his own townspeople. So the Galilee section can be divided into 3 chapters. The third chapter is where the kingdom is for Jew and Gentile. In other words, there is no distinction. The Gospel of Matthew is, in the ministry of Jesus, a very, very parochial gospel. It's a very restricted gospel, a very narrow-minded gospel, because in Matthew's gospel, very clearly, Jesus' mission is to those who he believes are the chosen ones. And so he's clear about it in the Gospel of Matthew, and he makes very, very strong distinctions. In Mark, however, and we shall see corresponding texts how the Markan Jesus is more open than the Matthean Jesus, in the corresponding texts which clearly show that Matthew has made the changes in his gospel to show that restriction, to show that narrow-mindedness, to show that parochialism, even though at the end of his gospel, Matthew becomes universal. Within the gospel, Matthew is parochial, stereotypical, narrow-minded. Later, at the end, he becomes universal. So Matthew's gospel is a tension between what may be termed as parochialism and universalism. In Mark, however, the kingdom is available very clearly, even though in a lesser manner, as we will see, even though in a lesser manner, but the kingdom is available for all. It is not a restricted kingdom. It is a kingdom where the disciples, and the third part, notice, the disciples are sent, but they are sent on mission. So like in the first two chapters, there is summary and something connected with the disciples. And I'm sure you can understand now that there is the broad part, which is connected with the kingdom. And here, the kingdom is for both Jew and Gentile. Mark's Jesus does not really make such a clear distinction as the Matthean Jesus makes. And his kingdom is available for Jew and Gentile. And once again, obviously, you can say that at the end, there is the conflict. And notice, if at the beginning of this Galilee section, the conflict was from outsiders, it comes now to the conflict his own townspeople, and it ends with a conflict by his own disciples. As a matter of fact, in chapter 8, verses 14 to 21, the last part of this Galilee section, Jesus poignantly asks his disciples, almost with pain in his heart, do you still not understand? And with that, the time is 11:40. I request you to come back at 11:50.